Hey everyone, and welcome back to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. Remember, you can find me down there on my social media accounts at SKeysImages. And today we're going to discuss why birders often struggle with bird photography. Now, to my bird photographer friends and to my birders, I need you to hold off and watch the entire video because I know some of the birders are probably already upset just about the title of the video. But this video is just about my opinion, and it also just talks about the mindset change and how a birder and a bird photographer essentially just approach things differently based off of the outcomes that they're trying to get. So watch the video to the end and I'll catch up with you then. Now, to illustrate the point of why birders make bad bird photographers, I'm going to tell you a quick story about two people that go out to shoot in the morning. Bob is a birder and Sally is a bird photographer. And at the end of the day, they come back and I ask Bob how his day was. And Bob says, "Oh my gosh, it was fantastic. We had 50 species and I got 2 county birds. And I also got a lifer and a rarity from the West Coast." And Bob is elated. And I ask Sally how her morning went. Side by side with Bob, but Sally's a photographer and she says, "It was pretty rough. I didn't even hit the shutter." And the reason is birders primarily are concerned with species and photographers are concerned with images. And those mindsets are very, very different. I get a lot of students that come to me and want to learn how to do bird photography. And many of them have a background in birding. And now they want to start to capture images differently. And the thing I ask all of them is to change their mindset. You're going to have to sacrifice a little bit in terms of species, quantities, numbers, and maybe even sometimes rarities in order to capture images that look pretty and are appealing and have good composition and take in key considerations like perspective, light, environment, all things that most birders don't generally think about. So up on the screen here, I'm going to list a few things. Things that birders generally don't think about, but photographers should. One is the species. Birders generally overvalue the species. Number 2 are locations, something that a photographer might be very concerned about, but a birder might not. In fact, I think locations are probably more important than the species themselves. Another consideration that a photographer would have that a birder might not is lighting. And then there's this concept of chasing. I want to talk about that a little bit more in depth, and then finally we'll talk about editing. So first, let's talk about subjects. When you're a birder, primarily your interest is the subject. Often a good day means lots of numbers or specific rarities. It almost never has to deal with the perspective of that bird or the location of that bird or the lighting. A birder is generally satisfied with what they would call a good look, or maybe spending a lot of time with a species, watching the behavior, watching it feed, or go about its daily business. What they're generally not concerned is, how does that subject look in relation to everything else in the frame? And that's why birders generally struggle when it comes to producing good photos. They are hyper-focused on species. Because they're also focused on quantities, a good day of birding often means seeing a lot of birds. That means you sometimes are moving from location to location to location very quickly, and often you don't have time to set up and find a good spot that will photograph well. So the most important reason, and really the paradigm mind shift between becoming a birder to a bird photographer, revolves around devaluing the species or the subject and thinking about all of the other components that create great images. Now, the next consideration about photography that I really value is locations. Some locations have great light. Some have great environment or great habitat. Some of them create super separation from areas of foreground to background. And those are all things I consider when I'm doing photography. But very rarely is that a consideration for a birder. They generally don't care a lot about location other than it might be nice to find that bird in a specific habitat that feels natural for that species. So a birder might be interested in finding a certain species in the habitat that it breeds in, but generally it's not a huge consideration. So again, when I talk about photography, locations are paramount. And in fact, I value the location more than the subject itself because a great location will often give you opportunities to photograph any species and make it look good. Let me give you an example here of a pretty common bird along the east coast of New Jersey. And this is a brant. And I was photographing a different species. But how good does this look in the right location? Just a common species. But how good does that look? Now, the next consideration is light. And light to me is the most important fundamental of all photography. It really doesn't matter what type of photography you're doing. Really, you're just capturing the light and the way that it interacts with other objects. So to that extent, light should be an important consideration for all photographers. But for birders, light really doesn't matter. Whether the light is strong or weak, as long as you can see the bird, doesn't matter if there's shadows on it. Doesn't matter if it's really hard or direct light or if it's very low light. But for a photographer, that light really does matter. Soft light may produce better images in some circumstance. Golden hour is always a premium for shooting wildlife. So light is a huge consideration for photographers, but again, often overlooked by birders. Now, this next concept for both photography and birding applies, and that's the concept of chasing. Now, chasing to me means that you are following a subject. So you see something that you like, and now you're going to approach it, whether it's a songbird up in a tree or a shorebird along the shoreline. Birders will sometimes chase a subject to get better views or to change the perspective, or maybe it's obstructed. Photographers have often learned in wildlife that chasing is not a good idea. Not just chasing the same subject from area to area, but just moving around a lot in general is often not a good idea for wildlife. Most of the best images that I take occur from patients waiting in one spot or predicting the behavior of an animal. I'll put a card up here about predictive behavior in wildlife photography. When you do that, the views become much more engaging as a subject might approach you rather than being working away from you. So backs turned to you, head turned from you, not getting good looks in terms of the profiles. So chasing birds for birders sometimes occurs, or at least chasing locations, going from spot to spot to spot. But for a photographer, often they will pick the spot that looks great and then wait for that moment to happen, or possibly see an opportunity presenting itself based off of behavior and then positioning themselves to wait for that opportunity to occur. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and it really is fundamental to all photography, is a basic understanding of editing. And birders don't consider this at all. I know a lot of birders that will just simply shoot in JPEG, come home, crop the image, and then share it on social media or upload it to a service like eBird. But most great wildlife photographers spend some time working on those images. It might be small finishing touches, exposure changes, adjustments to dodging and burning, or simply composing the image better in post-processing. There's a lot that can be done in editing, as we all know. But really, to me, editing has always been the icing on the cake. So bake it right in camera, finish it with the icing, and put those nice finishing touches on it. Something that every photographer should consider, but almost no birders really take a look at that. Now, one thing I do want to mention, can a birder become a great photographer and use those skills to their advantage? And the answer, fortunately, is yes. I think that great birders have a leg up in many areas over photographers. A lot of that has to do with behaviors, habitat, and also understanding sound. I know a lot of photographers that are very talented wildlife or bird photographers that don't really have a great understanding of wildlife, especially around birds. I've dealt with some photographers that I think are just phenomenal. And when it comes to even identifying a basic call out in the woods, they can't do it. So where does the birder have the advantage here? Well, once the birder starts to consider things like light and habitat and location, once they consider composition and environment and start looking at the big picture and stop hyper-focusing on the species or the subject, they have a competitive advantage with the knowledge that they've already acquired. So for example, walking in the woods and hearing a call of something that might be really interesting and stopping and looking and finding and now setting up a shot that works gives them a huge advantages in terms of the diversity of the species that they'll be able to capture in the long run. Also, understanding behaviors and habitats that they may have acquired over years of birding will certainly lead to opportunities for them in the field. So, while I say birders are not good bird photographers, they can be, and at some point they can use the skills they've acquired over the years to make themselves even better. So to illustrate that there are birders out there who are also exceptional photographers, I'm going to start with Melissa Hafting. Melissa's a birder up in British Columbia. Not only is she a great birder, but she's also involved in ethics and diversity and inclusion in her communities. So really admirable the work she's doing up there. But she's also a very skilled photographer. So you could see that she uses her travel, her ability to identify species, these unique opportunities she has to work with some very rare species and do more than just document them. So you could see Melissa Hafting here with some exceptional work. I got to know Alecia Smith a few years ago. She reached out and she wanted to improve her bird photography. She'd been working in conservation efforts around plovers in California, and she wanted to kind of step that game up and even maybe use some of her photography for marketing purposes. Because she had an intimate knowledge of both the habitats and the behaviors of these local populations, she was able to use that knowledge to her benefit as a photographer. And once she understood light, she really started to nail it. Look at these images that she's producing now over the last year, and you can tell that there's just a higher level of photography that's happening in her work. Quite simply put, Jerry Ligouri is the man when it comes to hawks. He's one of the leading experts in North America on raptors, and I asked if he'd be gracious enough to send over a few of his images because I've always admired his work, not just with hawk identification and research, but also just around the photographs. And I wanted to include Jerry's work to show that even somebody who's like a research scientist, an author, can leverage the unique experience that he has to create these images, these really beautiful, captivating images. And God, do I love raptor photography. By the way, probably the hardest type of photography that there is to do, but you can see by understanding the behavior and also utilizing the position that he's in, the physical environment, you get a sense of where these raptors are often. And I just really, really love it. I'm not going to do Jerry justice in 1 minute here, but please check out the description where I'm going to put some more information of his and where you can find both of his books and some of the articles about him. Because I'm a bit of a raptor nerd, I'm also going to link a video that he shared with me that's just so cool. So if you get a chance, check that one out as well. Jerry Ligouri. Love it. And speaking of researchers, I wanted to include this photographer, Sean Graesser. Now, Sean is a field biologist who also works a lot with bird banding. And in those situations, he's able to do some very unique setups and capture images like the ones you're seeing here. Now, these are just works of art. They're absolutely stunning. And I think it goes to show that, again, you can leverage a very unique situation to create works of art when you start thinking in terms of photography first. So in these situations, even though he's a field biologist and doing research, he's able to shift gears and capture images like these. And he doesn't use these visually stunning images just to promote his social media accounts, but he also uses them towards efforts in conservation. I've known Cameron Darnell for a few years, and I've watched him grow in his photography. He grew up as a birder, so this is his background, and he's got a great understanding of not just species in terms of identification, but he's also really great birding by ear. That gives him a leg up in the field, as he can identify things that he hears to work within his photography. I will tell you that Cameron made a shift a few years ago and really made photography his focus, and you can see it in his work. So now he leverages the skills that he grew up having in terms of identification, birding by ear, understanding habitat, and applies it now to his photography. And he really does have an impressive gallery. So if you haven't checked out Cameron's work before in the past, make sure you do so. And finally, my good friend Theodore Emery. Theodore and I have known each other for a few years. We've actually photographed together and traveled together. Theo has a background where he studied ornithology, he's been a field biologist and researcher, and he's got this great ability just to bird. He understands behavior and he's really good by ear. Similar to Cameron, he's been able to leverage those skills to produce some great images. His Instagram account is probably one of my favorite bird photography accounts, and if you scroll through there, you'll see why. Theo had the unique opportunity to take a year off and just do birding and photography. And it was really impressive to watch that year unfold. So if you haven't checked out his accounts, make sure you do that as well. And again, the theme is you can use your expertise in birding and your experiences in the past to really help your bird photography once you make that paradigm mind shift that the total image matters more than the species. Okay, and those are my thoughts about why birders sometimes struggle with bird photography. And as you can see, it really just is about the focus and about what is the priority to each individual. So while a birder may focus more on species and counts and numbers, the photographer is generally focused or concentrating on creating a scene. So it may only be one or two subjects in a day, but placing a value on what's around the subject in terms of light and habitat. So I think those are the fundamental difference between birders and bird photographers. It is now time for you to put your comments down at the bottom. And remember, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, go ahead and subscribe. So there's a subscribe button down there you can hit. And also, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like the video, thumbs down is okay. Just put a comment down there and let me know why. Now, if you're a birder interested in transitioning to bird photography, also check out my Patreon site. There I take you in the field and behind the scenes, and I also show you editing tips in both Lightroom and Photoshop. So check out patreon.com/wildlife inspired. I also want to make sure that I thank everybody for their continued support and feedback. It's been really great hearing from the followers and the subscribers. So thank you so much for your ongoing support, and I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.